Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into the history of Pan-Africanism, a story of foresight, unity, and enduring dreams. Let's begin by grounding ourselves in the heart of today's topic, Pan-Africanism. At its core, Pan-Africanism is the belief that people of African descent, whether they live on the continent or in the global diaspora, share a common history, destiny, and responsibility to work together for their collective freedom and right to flourish. It emerged as a direct response to global oppression, colonization, and racial injustice that Africans and people of African descent have faced for centuries. But Pan-Africanism is much more than just a political ideology or a call for unity. It is also deeply cultural and psychological. It recognizes that while our experiences are shaped by geography, whether we live in Lome, Kingston, Baltimore, or Bahia, our roots connect us. Our languages may be different, our music may carry different rhythms, but we share ancestral memories. The fight against slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and anti-Black racism binds us together. Pan-Africanism recognizes the fact that we are not isolated communities scattered across the globe. We are one people, and in that unity lies yet to be tapped strength. Pan-Africanism affirms our African identity in all its forms, not just in terms of borders, but through language, rituals, storytelling, food, fashion, and spirituality. It is the spirit behind resistance movements, behind independence struggles, behind cultural renaissances, from negritude to Afrobeats. Pan-Africanism is about self-definition, choosing our own heroes, telling our own stories, and charting our collective future. So as we move through this series, I want you to keep that broad vision in mind. Pan-Africanism as a global, living, breathing movement that continues to evolve, and one that needs each of us to carry it forward. So, why does Pan-Africanism still matter in today's world? Well, because the fractures that Pan-Africanism sought to heal are still with us, sometimes in new forms, sometimes in the same old ways. Even after the so-called end of colonization, African nations and people of African descent continue to face deep structural challenges: economic dependence, cultural erasure, border conflicts, underdevelopment, the refusal to make reparations for slavery and colonization, even if we know it's the just thing to do, and all forms of racial injustice that continue to cut across continents. Racism doesn't just stop when you cross borders. In other words, this idea that racism is the effects of racism are only felt when you're in the diaspora and all of that is just illogical. Racism is at the heart of the current world's, the current global economic power structures. So many of these challenges are not accidental. They are the legacies of trans-Saharan and transatlantic slave trades and the precursors of colonialism, which drew artificial borders, divided ethnic groups, imposed foreign languages, and left behind systems that continue to plague us by prioritizing the forces of exploitation over development. And yet, in this fractured world, Pan-Africanism offers a unifying vision, a way of remembering that we are not alone in our struggles, that the struggle for peace in Kinshasa, in Khartoum, in Port-au-Prince, in Chicago are all part of the same story. It's not all, yeah, but it's not all gloom though, because one promising thing today is the renewed energy from the youth in Africa and the African diaspora. It gives me hope. We're seeing young people from Lagos to London reclaiming African pride through language revival, Black-owned tech platforms, cultural festivals, and grassroots political movements. We are seeing Pan-African values rise again through digital activism, through music collaboration across continents, through books, art, and even through travel that's about reconnection, not just tourism. And let's not forget platforms like Africans Rising and their Borderless Africa initiative, the recognition of the diaspora as the sixth region of the African Union, and in spite of its shortcomings, the African Continental Trade Area. All these and other intercontinental cultural collaborations between peoples of African descent everywhere show that the Pan-African dream is still alive. Pan-Africanism today is not just about looking back, it's about looking forward together toward a future where Africans and people of African descent are not just surviving, but thriving on their own terms. And that's why this topic is urgent, because the more we understand this shared history and its purpose, the more power we have to change the present and shape the future. Incidentally, Pan-Africanism did not begin on the continent. It was born in diaspora, in the hearts and minds of Africans who were forcibly scattered across the world through the transatlantic slave trade. So in the 19th century, a new generation of Black intellectuals, clergy, and activists, many of whom had never even set foot in Africa or even knew precisely where their ancestors had been had been stolen in Africa, began to articulate a vision of unity and shared identity among people of African descent. One of the earliest figures was Martin Delany, an African American abolitionist and writer. Delany believed that Black people would never be treated equally in the US and advocated for a return to Africa, not just as a physical homeland, but as a site of dignity, self-determination, and rebirth. He saw Africa not as a place of shame, which was the way the colonial world had painted it, but as a place of future sovereignty and pride. Another foundational thinker was Edward Wilmot Blyden, born in the Caribbean and later a citizen of Liberia. Blyden, often called the father of Pan-Africanism, he rejected the idea that Africans needed to be civilized by Europeans and instead championed what he called the African personality, a unique cultural and spiritual identity rooted in African values, languages, and tradition. So, through the writings of Blyden, Delaney, Alexander Cromwell, and others, Pan Africanism began to take shape as a philosophy of resistance, pride, and unity, centering the belief that Africa had intrinsic worth and that Black people, no matter where they were born, had a stake in Africa's liberation. These early thinkers laid the groundwork for a global consciousness that would later be taken up by figures like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and several others. This ideological movement found early expressions in Liberia and Sierra Leone, where freed and repatriated Africans from the Americas, Britain, and the Caribbean attempted to build new societies on African soil. But these weren't perfect projects, just as nobody's ancestors were perfect. Liberia, for example, became a settler society that sometimes reproduced colonial hierarchies among indigenous people. But and yet, we must continue to acknowledge this aspect of history as some of the first modern attempts to reclaim African identity and autonomy on African land by people who had been violently exiled from it. So it's important to recognize that the early seeds of Pan Africanism were diasporic in nature. They were born out of exile, out of longing, and out of a fierce refusal to let Africa be defined by slavery or colonialism. So, in that sense, Pan Africanism was always transatlantic, always about return, restoration, and reconnection. And not just physically, but culturally and psychically. Thanks for watching. Please join me next time as we continue this journey. Remember, the Sankofa bird looks back, not to dwell in the past, but to bring the best of it forward. Let's carry it forward together.